Veterans Day. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar session titled MLOps in the Cloud, Integrating Machine Learning Operations with Software Lifecycle Standards. This webinar is presented by Rook Quality Systems and Galen Data. And just so you all know, this webinar is recorded, and the recording, slide deck, and a few additional educational resources will be sent out to you all tomorrow morning. We do encourage you all to ask questions throughout this webinar session, and we will address them at the end in our Q&A session. All right, we're going to start off with the speaker introductions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew. I'm a VP Medical Software at Rook Quality System and a General Manager of the APAC office. I got about 12 years of experience in the med device space. My prior life is, in fact, in the technical development space and software testing space. And once I joined Rook Quality System, I really wanted to bring that engineering development perspective into the quality regulatory strategy roadmap and really help the clients in the space. And our team got extensive experience in managing verification, validation, testing throughout all these years, not just for SAMD, but also for software in medical devices. And we are well versed in navigating international med device markets. We have an APAC office started 4 years ago. We are rapidly expanding to other continents as well. So our exposure to different regulatory jurisdictions can be beneficial to most of our clients. So thank you for having me today. So Rook Quality System is a quality regulatory consulting firm dedicated to developing and upkeeping quality system management. We're also providing regulatory services and some support in terms of engineering consultation to demonstrate quality regulatory compliance front. In a nutshell, we provide quality system design, maintenance. We do quality support, design control, risk management processes. On top of the regulatory submission support that we have a dedicated software team and cybersecurity team or vendors who can support various areas that the typical med device software manufacturer needs. We also provide post-market support on compiling CAPA, NCR, complaints, and can support on-site audit as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Abbas Dhilawala. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and one of the co-founders of Galen Data. I have about 20 plus years of experience in medical device software, a large amount of that in medical device cloud. I have experiences in other platforms as well. I'm well versed in software architecture, specifically around healthcare and also medical device software regulations and standards. And at Galen Data, my responsibility include product development, pre-sales, and customer success. Can you go to the next screen, please, Jackman? So just a little bit about kind of what Galen Data provides. So we provide a product called Galen Cloud. It's essentially a configurable cloud platform that allows you to have a lot of configurable items, such as data schemas, roles and permissions. We have a visualization engine that allows you to kind of present that information, whether it be the raw information or process information, back to your stakeholders that can include healthcare providers, that could include your partners or your internal teams or patients. We do provide for those who have a device as part of your offering, a device management solution as well that's integrated into the Galen Cloud. We also provide third-party data stores integrations specifically around healthcare, electronic healthcare records or laboratory information systems. We have workflows that can be tailored to onboard patients, clinicians, and partners, support multi-channel notifications within a few clicks that you can create a rule around data or lack of data. Plug and play approach to AI/ML or any other algorithm for that matter, and then logging and monitoring of these devices or AI/ML or any other algorithms. It's all purpose built for medtech. That's all we do. We sell to medtech. We are ISO 13485 certified. So all this product is built as if it was a medical device. We also operate under HITRUST. HITRUST is it's a cybersecurity framework that is the gold standard in healthcare cybersecurity, and we are certified to that, and that helps us both providing a peace of mind to our customers, but also helps us, the customers, in terms of their sales specifically to large healthcare systems. And it's a fully managed service. So we manage all the IT backend, all the headache that comes with running an IT system. That includes backup, restores, data localizations, ability to kind of have geographic redundancies and stuff like that. Thanks for having me.
Great. So today we're going to talk about the first part of it. The webinar is going to talk about the common challenge and solution addressing the MLOps that's hosted on cloud, versus on-premise, right? So there are some, specifically, we're going to talk about privacy and security of the data, and then dig into the data pipeline, how the strategy for synchronizing DevOps and MLOps, the approach to deployment, IT scaling capabilities, and lastly, monitoring and logging. And second part of the presentation, we're going to talk about how Rook quality systems and Galen data can support you, and based off a few practical examples that we have provided value to our clients already. Okay, all right, next slide, please. So start from the beginning. Let's talk about why it is difficult to regulate AI ML enabled devices in general. Right? As everybody know, IEC 624 is a essential gold standard for developing software med device. However, it is clear that the development process described in that standard is inadequate for developing AI ML algorithms in general. Right? So that's why regulatory agencies such as FDA, Health Canada, UKCA, all jointly try to develop GIMLP guiding principles. And there are many working groups and chatter about what's the upcoming regulation is going to be like. So why not we focus on why this is such a challenging task for regulators, so that the manufacturers and the vendors can really try to address all these challenges proactively before the regulation actually fall into places, right? So the first challenge is the trained algorithm obviously might perform differently across population, right? So generalizability in different deployment condition obviously is something that the regulators care a lot about. And secondly, security consideration on different type of artifacts that the ML devices, ML device development throughout that development would be generated, such as the data, the model assets, and many other artifacts that we're going to talk about for the rest of the presentation, actually lead to more complicated regulatory reviews and additional consideration from the regulators as well. The second part is change management. It is a necessity for ML devices because the ML devices obviously would experience degradation of algorithm. Most likely, they will be experiencing degradation algorithm from the different data, input data, inference data distribution, or eventually causing the data drift or even the model drift. You have to have certain processes for monitoring, logging, monitoring, and maintain the performance, right? So that is why there are proposal like PCCP guidance come into play, because change management is, on the ML device front is, it's inevitable, right, to maintain the performance of the algorithm. And lastly, the end user, in fact, needs to be very aware and be able to trust and interpret the device outputs. They have to be, be provided with clear instructions for use and user manuals, what they should be anticipating, what is the performance baseline when the device being first deployed, any anomalies that they observe, they also should be aware of that too, so that the manufacturer can proactively try to address those anomalies and it really identify the root cause of these, right? And, so the additional validation and labeling effort are also needed too, right? So these are just a really high level consideration from a regulator's point of view, and we're gonna dive into each of the topic that we lay out in the outline and the previous slide, but hopefully all the rest of the presentation would be resonating and addressing these challenges adequately when you finish, listening to this webinar. Okay. Next slide, please.
So let's start with the privacy and security of data, right? So privacy and security of data isn't a AIML specific issue. It's not even a healthcare specific issue. It's just a general issue. But we do have laws and regulations that protect sensitive data across various jurisdictions. A lot of them, specifically in the United States, we have HIPAA, which is very focused on healthcare data. So we want to understand, how building any healthcare system or healthcare software, how the privacy and security of data is important. What changes here is that there is specific, the amount of data, maybe the amount of kind of data or the compute environment that we have with the IML introduces additional challenges. So we want to understand how we do from day one, understand what the privacy implications are of our system and how do you address them right away. And the reason is, um, there's serious consequences for organizations when you don't follow privacy and security requirements. You can have lots of sensitive information that alone can be a big issue, but that can lead to other civil issues, right? Some of this information can then be used to target certain individuals for further misuse. So you can have essentially a kind of a linked set of issues that you have because you didn't protect properly the root information that came out there. There's a lot of financial penalties, both from regulators at the national level, but also state and local jurisdictions as well. And these can add up pretty quickly, and some are really damaging, like in GDPR. I believe the penalties can be as high as 10%, I believe, of your revenue, of your global revenue. So it can pretty add up quickly. So if you don't have adequate protection, it can be potentially killing your company. But there's also reputational damage. Even if you survive the issue, there's a reputational aspect to it. So, and do your customers trust you again? If you had an event like that, what would your sales look like? What would your customer base think of you? So there's a reputational damage that's important as well. Complicating this is that different regimes have slightly different requirements of what is to be protected, how something needs to be protected, and then if there is an issue, what happens. In terms of notification requirements, in terms of penalties, all that kind of stuff is different. Ultimately, it's very paramount to consider data privacy and security from the get-go. When you start your MLOps architecture, that includes data ingestion during design, how you store data, when you manage data, to actual operations, and how you're how that model itself is protected, and then how you protect against a variety of cyber events. Next slide, please. So some of the ways to address these are not exhaustive lists. There's just some of the things we can do. We can start from the get-go by using a compliant platform that reduces our need to what we need to do. So compliant platforms, again, it depends on jurisdiction what compliance are required. So I'm going to take an example based in the US, for example. At the federal level, we have HIPAA, which controls privacy requirements for healthcare data. So a traditional public infrastructure can be HIPAA compliant. So for example, I'm going to use the AWS as an example. AWS can be made HIPAA compliant. It's not HIPAA compliant out of the box, and you be very careful there. So if you just bring up a sort of EC2 servers and start doing stuff, it's not HIPAA compliant. But there are tools available, so you need to know the tools that are there that can enable you to make AWS a HIPAA compliant system, including signing an agreement with AWS. But you can use other compliant platforms. So one example is our platform. We have a compliance built in from the get-go. So things like that allow you to kind of jumpstart on your privacy and security requirements. Basic things that people can do is, and very useful and very simple to do is encryption, right? You encrypt everything, encrypt data when it's stored, encrypt data when it's moving between components or from to the outside or from and to the outside world. But one thing people do tend to not pay attention. Everybody encrypts now. I mean, it's kind of standardized thing. But what is, we see a lack of management of those encryption. What I mean is the key management solution. A lock is as good as how you save the key, right? So you lock your house and you put a key under your mat, it's not very safe. So the key management is as important as picking the right encryption solution. So make sure that we do encrypt data and also do a proper key management solution. Access control, periodically review who and what has access. So not just people, but other systems have access to this whole ML ops infrastructure, and use the least privilege principle. Essentially, what is the minimal amount of access you need to do that function? And it's very easy to just say allow all on every screen that allows you to ask for access, but you don't really think about what are you trying to do here is trying to protect your operations and your data. So try to give as little as possible, and then expand from that point on. Log all access to data. So that will be very useful both from a review perspective, so you can quickly review what is accessing what and see if that access control is needed, because access control needs to change over time. As you're designing early on, you may just want everything just for safe, just for making it easy, but over time you need to make sure you control that properly. Again, these are requirements within the laws, so you need to make sure you do that. But also, if there's an incident, the access log will help you a lot understanding the pattern, what is happening, who is doing what, and it's very useful. You can also build your ML pipeline or your ML architecture essentially with data privacy techniques. This is an advanced topic, but if you do need some of these, if you really uh, if you really have requirements to really manage that privacy, some techniques out there that can be used. So some examples here, for example, a privacy preserving machine learning or PPML technique. What happens there is essentially you have access to data that is encrypted using homomorphic encryption technologies. And so your machine learning model doesn't need to necessarily decrypt it, which means it doesn't need the keys, it doesn't need to know the actual data, but it can do operations on that particular data while protecting sensitive data. There's other things like differential privacy or local differential privacy. A lot of big companies do that. For example, Apple on their Apple Intelligence and Google on its Gemini on the phone, for example, will use some of these techniques that allow limit what data is transmitted. And local differential, there's no transmission ever, right? So there's a lot of learning that happens locally, but he still uses data external to it and benefit from the external data. Transfer learning is an important technique, not necessarily useful everywhere. In most cases, it's probably not going to be applicable, but it's if you have an existing pre-trained model that is sort of in that problem area that you're trying to address, and can you reuse that model and try to train for a new problem? The idea that is that the existing trained model is already just on a lot of data being trained, so you don't need to have access to that data. Again, it doesn't work everywhere, but it's an interesting approach. And then federated machine learning essentially allows reduction of data surface by federating out a lot of the data. So again, these are techniques. Again, you have to think about this upfront, day one, on what kind of privacy and security model you're going to have, and you're going to some of these require architectural changes on how you do machine learning at all. Next, please. Yeah.
Right. Once we have covered the privacy aspect of it, let's dig into the data pipeline. Data pipeline essentially it's a series of operation in sequence on the available data that leads to supplying the training and testing of the data sets. Right? Robustness of data pipeline operation obviously is essential because this is obviously the most upstream process of that entire ML operation. To establish the standardized data pipeline on the cloud environment actually have some advantages over on-premise. So first, simplifying the data ingestion access process, especially on the cloud, can be relatively easy to implement because of all the toolkits that you have, and obviously you need to know the pros and cons of utilizing and configuring those toolkits. But once you get some familiarity with it, this can be super helpful, especially when you try to introduce automated data validation pipeline or model validation pipeline. This can be a good approach to establish all these data pipeline essentials, and additional considerations such as the pipeline trigger and the metadata management are also quite accommodating in the cloud environment. So this is something that, when you're trying to pick and choose certain toolkits that you use on Azure, GCP, or AWS, that you have to pay close attention to, okay? And secondly, the consistency on computing environment. ML services obviously experience different level of traffics, and it's always good to have the ML service to be able to auto scale up and down accordingly, and to support the orchestrated, well-orchestrated CI/CD pipeline to function based on your expectation, right? And especially when the data sources can be from multiple fronts, right? It can be from the real-time streaming, it can be from batch, it can be from change data capture. A lot of this, data stream comes in, and a lot of activity would happen, right? Even the data qualifying events that would take on some computing power, let alone the training and the eventual validation part in the CI/CD pipeline. So have a consistent computing environment is in fact quite essential, and it's allow a relatively more stable CMD performance in general. And lastly, enabling the storage of sharing code or results. And this is obviously a very important area from a regulator's perspective, essentially the configuration management practices and the evidence. The ability to share artifacts that's being produced throughout the ML operation, such as the models, the components, the environment, the scripts, to be able to reproduce the exact model training results, or try to retrain the results. These artifacts are very essential, right? And at the end of the day, what the FDA require you for the submission, on top of the typical software code base that that's kind of wrapping around the ML engine or ML algorithm, you essentially have to trace all these artifacts by the release version of the model itself, or the training, the data version that the model is based off, for instance. So there are a lot of configuration management information that the FDA would inquire, not just at the pre-market stage, but also during the audit stage as well. A lot of things can happen in the post-market stage. So to be able to identify the exact version and would actually allow you to identify the root cause of a certain anomaly much faster and much more precise. Right? So we already talked briefly about some regulatory quality consideration that you have to pay attention to when you're managing the data pipeline. But can you go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. But I would like to highlight just a few additional ones that I thought the audience would be curious about. Generalizability of the training and validation data set. FDA typically asks quite a lot of information on this front, because they want to make sure that your device is being deployed to an environment where this algorithm can still maintain certain performance, right? So they'll be looking at the training data distribution, the validation data distribution, and descriptive statistics across different sites. The data size and how to split for training, tuning, testing. These are essential information that you have to provide it to the FDA. Distribution of the data alongside acquisition condition. I guess this is specifically pertaining to medical imaging application. Okay, let's take an example. If you're building a segmentation model, right, that allows you to take CTA images from different makers, Toshiba, Siemens, or many others, right? And you can basically generate a segmented model for eventual flow simulation, for instance. Okay. However, when you're gathering the data, you will encounter different models, or even different imaging parameters, such as different pulse sequence that you're getting, and different protocol across different institutions. How are you going to present this information to the FDA is essentially would determine whether the FDA consider your training process is adequate versus not. So a lot of these upstream data management processes, based off the FDA regulator's perspective, is in fact very important. And you can gather a lot of this information through pre-submission and many other encounter that you have, with the regulatory agency, right? So lastly, just the data set sampling methods obviously needs to take into consideration. And the ingestion, transformation, storage, versioning process, we already talk a lot about it. How do you plan to demonstrate compliance to the FDA based on the technical information that you gather? Or even post pre-market evaluation during the audit? How are you going to demonstrate compliance against all these processes? And in addition to that, because there are many regulatory jurisdiction that trying to establish certain processes, even though there's a regulatory convergence among their regulation in general, but the regulation obviously would be evolving over time and quite rapidly in the next few years. How do you become proactive on all these fronts and be ready when the regulation actually set in stone? Is in fact try to be in the regulator's shoes and think about the safety and effectiveness of device being impacted by the inadequacy of these processes, right? So this is a very essential consideration when you start digging into the data pipeline design and the implementation aspect of it. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about data pipeline, which is one of the 3 key work streams for developing AI ML system, which is described in the green box at the top. We're gonna extend our conversation into the ML pipeline, where you train, evaluate, tune, package, compile, deploy, and service your model, which sits in the middle in purple block. And lastly, the software code pipeline, where you intend to embed or integrate your ML algorithm with the rest of your code base or the rest of your software system. So we would like to touch on all these three work streams as an integral part of your QMS, right? So you have to treat the relevant QMS processes, such as design control, risk management, post-market surveillance, with careful consideration, with all the technical development that you have going on, and also meeting the quality regulatory front as well. Okay, right. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on the data set front, we're spending quite a lot of time talking about it, but on this slide, I'll just focus on one thing: the ground truthing process. Okay, ground truthing process is very essential because this is where your baseline comes in, how you evaluate the performance of your device, sensitivity, specificity, ROC curve, AUC curve, all these metric, right? It's obviously based off the ground truth data. And the ground truth data gathering and curation is in fact something that the FDA would be very curious about upfront. So before you do any of the training, when you gather all these information in place, we highly suggest you to at least reach out to the FDA and confirm that the ground truthing process is receptive by the FDA. Okay.
The second part of this is we would like to ensure that the traceability across the artifacts stored in a registry or even in the configuration management source system can allow you to eventually trace the version information very precisely. And lastly, I'd like to highlight a bit on the personnel qualification, resource allocation front by describing 2 distinctive personas. Okay, so the first is ML engineer and the ML operation engineer. These 2 roles are essential, not just the data pipeline stage, but also in the ML pipeline stage, or even at the integration stage with the rest of the code base. Why is that? the ML engineer obviously really wanted to iterate quickly on ideas, right? They wanted to monitor the score prediction or sweeps for hyperparameter tuning and just keep tracking metrics and results and ensure that the version model checkpoints are being met and the data sets that they track have a good version control. However, when you think from the regulatory preparation point of view, you have to do internal validation. You also have to do external validation. Your model, your product, in fact, needs to be deployed on site to achieve certain external validation endpoints and to integrate to the existing clinical workflow, for instance. So the ML operation engineer, what they have to do is to be sure that the infrastructure is scaled to the extent that support all these external validation requirements. They have to ensure that provisioning of environments and the tooling that they built can all support these activities, right? Let alone all these ML model eventually will be integrated as part of your software code base. So the software engineer who built, test, release, and monitor those apps, they have to take the ML model into consideration when integrating all these underneath the entire application for the FDA to review. So streamlined communication across these two persona and also the software engineer are in fact a common challenge that we have seen from majority of our clients. Okay, next slide, please. So secondly, we're going to dig into the ML pipeline. Okay, so training, validation, consideration obviously needs to be addressed in the ML pipeline. Training specifically, we were talking about the subset analysis based on certain confounding factors that you have to identify upfront, or at least have conversation with the FDA and let them whether agree or critique the inadequacy of you identifying confounding factor, for instance, right? And validation consideration, for instance, you have to consider risk-benefit profile of your device after being deployed to the standard care environment in the US, for instance, if you're pursuing commercialization. The performance metric definition obviously needs to be based off that, and FDA would pay very close attention to how you define those metrics. Secondly, we're going to talk about it, provisioning environment and build tooling to allow a robust orchestration for external validation. A lot of this, it's very obviously, it's really case by case, but what we're trying to demonstrate here and what we're trying to emphasize here is that throughout the ML pipeline, there are so many factors that you have to take into consideration, not just on the engineering front to meet certain engineering performance standards or non-functional standards, non-functional requirement, etc., but also to demonstrate all of these under a compliant manner is in fact something that we have to, really establish a very robust training regimen for the ML team as well, on top of the typical SDLC team that we have already, right? So how are we going to ensure that all these designs are being demonstrated compliant to your procedure or eventually robust enough for the FDA to review during the regulatory submission process is in fact a very lengthy and extensive process in general. Next slide, please. And as Abbas already mentioned, there are multiple things that you have to do after your device is being deployed to the market. But before we do that, we have to take into consideration when you're integrating your ML engine to the functional code base, right? You have to ensure that the ML engine and the functional code base are integrated properly. All the requirements on the ML engine and on the rest of the functional requirement of your software app can all achieve its intended performance. But here I would like to highlight a particular use case when we're talking about continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous testing. When you're trying to implement those methodology or those approach on both the functional code base and ML engine, there are additional consideration that you have to pay attention to. For instance, continuous integration is no longer about testing and validating the code and the components, but also about testing and validating data, data schemas and models and all these artifacts, right? And that's another layer of complexity to it. If we talk about continuous delivery, it's no longer about a single software package or a service, but an entire system. That should automatically deploy to another service, for instance. Obviously there's another complicated scenario that you have to address when you're implementing a CD pipeline with the ML component embedded in there. Continuous testing, obviously, we're to talk a lot about this. Not just, it is not a heuristic code base. Obviously, you have to take into consideration of how the ML algorithm would behave over time, and to consider whether it's necessary to do retraining or how to service the model properly based off the compliant processes that you demonstrate to the FDA. All these, in fact, are quite complex. There would be additional resources that to put in, and like Abbas was saying, there will be a lot of additional personnel that you have to try to scale up to support all these activities. Okay, next slide, please. So here I'm just gonna brief through it because Abbas already mentioned it at a very extensive approach. Tracking summary statistic obviously is very important to monitor the anomalies. You have to generate alerts, notification when the anomalies are detected. You wanted to ensure that the version of the model is being maintained so that when a rollback is necessary, you can certainly implement that procedure. And like I already mentioned multiple times already, periodically retrain the model to adapt to changes to the real world is also very essential during the post-market stage. Okay. Next slide, please.
Nice. So let's talk about deployments. As Andrew mentioned, once you develop a system, it's no longer just a software package, it's a whole system because it has the model and then associated data with it. You need to deploy that. So deployment, when you start, deployment is always complicated, but now you have a more complicated system. The two things that people don't think up front, because again, these affect how you architect your system, architect your machine training models, but also how you architect your MLOps in general, is cost, talent, and security consideration. So we want to make sure that people are aware of how to manage that, right? So cost includes operational cost. Machine learning models tend to have a unique profile on how they work. The scalability is different than a general purpose software. So operational and some of the resources, like GPUs, for example, tend to be costlier than just general purpose CPUs. So there's an operational cost that can be pretty much higher. How do you scale that up and down as needed? Optimization is another a very newish field for machine learning on how to optimize those operations so that you can reduce cost, how to make sure GPUs are idle. If you have a farm of those, how to make sure that your data is in the right place as needed. So caching and things like that become important. So understanding kind of those costs drive how you manage your design and development of model, but also how you manage the delivery of models. Another cost is the maintenance cost. So as Andrew kind of mentioned, it's way machine learning models are different, or machine learning systems in general are different than a general purpose software systems, because you have these, most software systems are very, very predictive in nature. And if it's failing, it's going to fail. If it doesn't fail, it will fail. But with machine learning models, you have changes over time. You have drifts, you have performance issues. And so there's a constant maintenance aspect to it. So what's the cost in both of personal, but also in terms of resources and non-personal resources has to be considered, because that again affects how you staff, how you develop, and how you deploy. Cybersecurity cost, again, something we want to understand up front, as there's, both from controls you put in upfront, controls you have to monitor, but also costs around, you know, insurance, for example, or costs around just risk mitigations at the business level. So those are the costs to consider as well. And then the last thing around cost, indirectly, is the talent. There is a unique roles, or some of the unique roles within a machine learning operations. For example, Andrew mentioned ML ops engineer, which is a kind of a new persona, new profile, someone who understands both machine learning, but also traditional IT systems, and kind of someone who can run that machine learning operation. They tend to be less accessible and more costlier resources. So essentially understanding the available talent, and that defines your deployment plan. Are you deploying? Are you using a partner? Are you onboarding people? When to onboard people? So there's a lot of business processes that can change depending on these cost considerations. So always make sure that you consider both the direct cost and the indirect cost. And then the other aspect around deployment is, how are you deploying? Where are you deploying? And then what security challenges those bring? Obviously, cloud deployment makes things easy in some cases in terms of cost management. For example, you can fine tune the cost very easily. A lot of the systems like AWS, for example, would give you an ability to control resources at a very minutiae level. But once you go to the cloud, you do expose a little bit more security aspects to it, because now you're running something, in a different network. So secure data handling, both at the early stage of design development, so your data ingestion pipelines, to your MLOps pipelines, to your CI/CD, regular CI/CD pipelines. Make sure that data is handled properly, and taken care of early on, right? So your engineers that need to train your model, or that are doing the cleaning, that are doing the labeling, understand both from a technology perspective, what to do, what not to do, but also from a process perspective. A lot of security can be handled by technology, but there's a set of processes you have to institute within the organization in terms of data handling. What you can do, cannot do. For example, you can't print stuff and leave it on a table, or just talk about it in the elevator. Things like that need to be considered as well. A model protection, your model is both your IP, but it's also your product that can be sensitive to cyber attacks. So just like any software, you do a threat modeling, you do a threat modeling for the model as well. A ML model does expose additional kinds of attacks. Specifically, for example, if you're doing and a large language model, input queries or can be designed in a way to kind of make your models go crazy, right? Things like that. So you need to understand what are your protections around those kind of attacks. How do you put both built-in protections, but also ability to monitor those attacks and have a response plan for that. Infrastructure security, this is very common across any software system. There's no different here. I want to make sure infrastructure security is taken care of. That includes, making, again, I talked about a few things like least privilege systems, setting that up. There's a lot of standards out there, both from the US government that produces these kind of standards through CISOs and other things, but also a bunch of ISO standards that talk about infrastructure security, for example, ISO 27001 and high trust and things like that. So make sure you understand these infrastructure security requirements. Again, if you're partnering with a company like us, we take care of that, a lot of that stuff. But if you're not, you're building on your own, there is a shared dynamic here, or shared responsibility around general infrastructure security. And then continuous monitoring. This is absolutely needed. You're not going to be able to protect everything up front. You don't even know everything up front. So continuous monitoring is absolutely important aspect to it. And we'll make sure that you have an incident response plan, because incidents may happen. There's a good chance it happens as you grow, specifically as you become a bigger target. There is an incident response plan, and that includes things like what to do, who to contact, who in your team is responsible for what are the procedures. Make sure those procedures are accessible as well. We had a case where the procedures are electronic, and the system under attack included that procedure system, or system that hold the procedures, so nobody can even get to the procedures. So make sure you have a way to get to the procedures when something goes down, and that could be going back to like things like just print it out and keep it in a closet somewhere. But have an incident response plans and train to it, because if you don't train, if the first time you're trying to go into a response plan is when an incident actually happens. It's going to be very, very hard to like follow through and make sure everything goes right. As things like that. Next slide, please. Hi. Next thing I want to talk about is the scaling. All IT systems eventually have to scale, but with machine learning, some of the scaling happens up front. Most IT systems or general software systems don't need a lot of data to design and develop. Well, that's different here. So you have to start thinking about how you're managing a large amount of data upfront, and then how you're managing the operational aspects later on. So things to, some of these things you think later in a normal process, you have to think earlier upfront in a machine learning system. But it can be done. You just need a proper action plan. Things like, what are your scaling strategies? For resources specifically, compute resources or memory resources. Are you doing horizontal, which means you're adding more of these units as need be? Your data storage, generally easier to do that. With compute, it may or may not be easier to do that. Depends on your architecture. Again, if you have distributed computing, you can add a horizontal nodes to it. But if you don't have a distributed computing, you have to go vertical, which means you have more powerful systems. You have to replace your existing system with a more powerful system, one that has more GPU, more RAM, more onboard processing capabilities for other things, bandwidth and stuff like that. Vertical scalability has its limit. It can also get very, very costly. So again, goes back to kind of how you design your MLOps system or your machine learning system in general to kind of take account into how you're going to scale. For the auto scale, which is kind of very common in normal systems, but may not always work very well within a machine learning system. So you may have schedule scaling strategy, specifically if you know your user pattern, if you know how data is being moved around, how the compute profile looks like, you can do scheduled scalings. So again, some things to think about, caching, bringing data closer to where you need, bringing the compute closer to where the users are, those kind of things can help as well. And then distributed data processing, again, depends on your architecture, whether you can do this or not. It is complex, but it can be worth, specifically if you're dealing with a large amount of, if your model is very huge, right? So if you have large models, you do need to be able to do distributed data processing. Next slide, please. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about, at least on this end, is monitoring. So as Andrew mentioned, model will degrade over time. That's normally how this will work. So you got to monitor that, right? Post-market surveillance is required, and that part of that includes, the precision and the precision of your model. So if you're claiming, let's say, a 95% confidence level on certain thing, then you want to make sure that that is maintained over time. And so to monitor that precision and the right output, you have to monitor a set of metrics, and you got to log the data that's relevant to those set of metrics. So some of the metrics I kind of put here is, around the data input. Is the data quality the same as you use in training? Or is the data on a feature drift? What are the outliers? Are you seeing more outliers? ML model itself, the model drift, that happens, configuration of model to make sure that you are using the right model, that the versioning is right as well. Again, with the model, there's a set of things you have to configure, not just the model itself, the associated data, the associated configuration, with the associated software that comes with us as well. So both model configuration and versioning is important to monitor. Prediction drift, so even your data might be some of the same, your model features are same, but maybe you're getting a different prediction ratio, different prediction results than what you had in your training data set. So those are the kind of things to specifically ML things to kind of monitor. And then in general infrastructure monitoring, operation performance of your model, what is the level of GPUs or CPUs or memory is being using, what the scaling look like, what's the latency to the user, any errors that you're seeing, consumption of resources, and then ultimately costs. You got to measure the cost pretty rapidly because the cost profile changes pretty quickly. Next slide, please. I know we're running a little late, so I'm going to hand it all back to Andrew.
Right. I'm going to, I think the very last part of the presentation, I'm just going to briefly touch on the predetermined change control plan. Okay. So this is something that not just the FDA, but the other jurisdiction has started adopting. for the obvious reason, because the model might degrade over time, and there's a very high likelihood that it will. So the intent is to obviously maintain or even improve the safety and effectiveness of the data, right? And the modification included in a PCCP must within the device intended use. So there are a few considerations. This is the first consideration to confine the scope of PCCP. And the second consideration is that the device that you impose on changes under a PCCP has to remain substantially equivalent to the predicted device if you pursue a 510K clearance of the original application, okay? And third, if there are minor modification on the indications for use, you then have to justify to the FDA why the safety and effectiveness would not be affected, okay? For instance, when there are changes to software that can be deployed on additional operating system or a different data vendor or sources like we talked about earlier in the presentation, or a compatibility with other devices, right? It can be a algorithm that's agnostic to an ECG platform, hardware platform, for instance, to incorporate that marketing claim to the mix. Obviously, you made some minor modification to the indications for use, but you can certainly justify to the FDA that this can be within the PCCP. Okay, so the key elements of PCCP, as we laid out in this slide, first is the description of the modification. Okay, so I'll summarize. I mean, in general, the modification can be categorized into three cohorts. Okay, first is performance specification. So this is where you try to improve the analytical or clinical performance based on new data sets, okay? And second part is device inputs. You are including new sources of the data, might be from different makes, models, version of the data acquisition system, but you are doing this device inputs modification just slightly. Okay, you have to be able to justify that including these new sources of data, it's not imposing any risk in general, right? At the end of the day, this is what the FDA cares about the most. And third, for use within a specific subpopulation or a localization based on a specific clinical site or patient. For instance, if your initial device performed relatively subpar at a certain clinical site, okay, you observed that, and you wanted to figure out why, and you found out that, okay, that initial training data, that data distribution seems to be more deviate. Well, the inference data from the actual deployment site, that data distribution deviate from the initial training data set by way too much. Okay, so obviously you wanted to bring back the performance to the original claim. So you wanted to do a localized change to it, right? So this particular site might be receiving a model that's being updated with the new training data to address that concern. Okay. The second part, modification protocol. Obviously, this is a way to outline the methods for implementing, developing, and validating the modifications. You obviously have to ensure that the methods supports all the QMS processes, and the section that you include at a high level, because constraint of time, we're not gonna dig into, but happy to take questions on this front. You have to mention the data management practices, the retraining practices, how you perform the evaluation, and how do you update the software in general. Right? So these are the area that you have to address in the protocol. And lastly, what's the impact of this particular PCCP to your original submission, and also to the eventual client or deployment site that you are imposing certain updates to. Okay, so let's dig into a few examples, two examples specifically. Okay, next slide, please. So first example is fairly simple. what our past client wanted to achieve within the PCCP is to retrain a ML model based on new data. Specifically, what they wanted to do is new data will be added to training and tuning data set. And the ML model will be retrained using that data set. Okay. They also specify that the data will be acquired from the same population demographic. And they also specify that there are certain processes that they try to manually procure the training data, but also deploy across all devices on the market, right? It's not a localized effort, but it's a global approach, or like, across the entire clientele that they serve. Okay, and next slide, please. And obviously they have been experiencing some model degradation, and they suspect it's the data drift. So they dig into it. They found a few subgroup or cohorts of data set that they thought would cause that model drift at a more drastic way. So they obviously wanted to inform the user on why they're doing this performance upkeep or this analytical improvement. And within the app itself, there is on top of the IFU, it does have a ML training spec sheet that gives the user a clear idea where that performance baseline is supposed to be at, what was the performance like before the model being updated and after the model being updated. And there is a series of risk assessment being introduced here to the FDA, and FDA eventually agreed to this retraining proposal in their PCCP based on the new data. And obviously there are many information, there are so much information that you have provided to the FDA, and many factors that you have to consider to allow a PCCP to be receptive by the FDA, right? So we highly encourage you guys to look into the guidance document, because it's very detailed comparing to many other guidance documents that the FDA published in the past. So so there are a lot of great information, good examples within there that you can try to leverage. Okay, so that's, dig into the second PCC modification that FDA did not accept at the end. Okay, next slide. So they wanted to train a new model for detecting a different biopsy marker. Okay, so the initial 510(k) cleared model is able to detect biopsy marker. We call it product A by a manufacturer A. Okay, and they wanted to they want to train a new model because they experience some difficulty to generalize the model to recognize both biopsy marker product A and product B within the same model. They could not achieve that from the engineering experimentation that have done. So that's why they're proposing a new model to the FDA. This is where we're gonna build, and obviously the user will be fully aware that there is a new model, and that's accustomed to recognizing product B. And all these information were provided to the FDA. And a lot of these are similar to the same line of thoughts that is being shared in the first case study, but obviously the approach is slightly different, and the endpoints that they're trying to get to is different as well. Okay, next slide, please. And I don't think I should address any of this anymore, because at the end of the day, this PCCP proposal was rejected by the FDA. Specifically, what the FDA said is, it appears that you intend to create a new device function since you're planning to develop an additional ML model. It might be difficult for full review on a new device function within the context of PCCP, as it could raise different question of safety effectiveness or modify the device intended use. Okay, so obviously FDA cannot fully assess the impact of this additional model. For instance, the client did not provide the utility of the first biopsy biomarker that they're recognizing versus the second one? What if the biopsy marker is being utilized in different clinical scenarios, right? And the standard of care, from the standard of care perspective, if the biopsy marker is leveraged in the different case scenario, such as intraoperative versus preoperative, then the risk profile will be drastically different. So when you're building something, a new function to recognize a different biopsy marker, even though that's cleared by the FDA in the past, but perhaps the utility of that biopsy biomarker is in fact different during the clinical workflow, right? So FDA obviously wanted to elaborate more on that front, the exact risk benefit of this particular model, this particular proposal versus the original clearance. But at the end of the day, FDA did not accept this eventual proposal based on multiple reasons I will not get into. However, I just want to emphasize that the PCCP guidance does lay out the exact information that you need to incorporate into a PCCP proposal. And it does provide a very robust catalog of case studies to leverage. So I highly encourage everyone to look into it. And in fact, I think starting from August this year, the PCCP actually covers also non-ML devices as well. There's a new guidance that talks about it. And I think this is a paradigm shift from the FDA perspective, because they really wanted to focus on that entire product lifecycle of a software, right? During the, during its lifetime. Right? There will be multiple changes that you want to introduce. And this is a clear pathway that the FDA established for you as a manufacturer to consider. And there might be not just on the compliant front, you can benefit from it, but also from the business front, right? So not a business person here, but I think there are many consideration that across the function, across multiple function within a med device manufacturer that you can consider with a PCCP proposal. Okay, so we're going to conclude today's webinar here. Happy to take any further question. I have answered a few, but we have about 10 to 12 minutes to answer all your questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Abbas. This was all great, very informative. Before we do begin the Q&A session, I did want to let you all know that Rook Quality Systems is currently actively working on a lot of educational content related to MLOps, good machine learning practices, PCCPs, and more related topics. So be on the lookout on our LinkedIn and our website for any upcoming blog posts or ebooks. We love kind of sharing helpful content, and we typically do all of this for free as well, and make it in a very easy to understand way. So just stay tuned for that. And then if you have any additional questions regarding how Rook Quality Systems can support your team with developing or deploying compliant MLOps, or just understanding the guidelines behind machine learning, then we encourage you to either visit our website or to email us directly at info@rookqs.com. And then if you have more information on the capabilities of Galen Data or scheduling a demo with them, visit Galen Data's website or email them at hello@galandata.com. So now we're going to dive into just a few of your questions. We'll take questions for probably about the next 10 minutes. And if we don't get to your question on the live session today, we will make sure to answer those and share any responses from Andrew or Abbas when you get the webinar recording and slide deck all tomorrow. Okay, so it looks like we have quite a few questions. And so looks like, Andrew, you're working on this one. Considering the unique challenges in regulating AI and machine learning enabled devices, particularly with model performance across different populations, conditions, and drift, are there any emerging frameworks or best practices that could guide a software medical device company in developing its own approach to categorizing and assessing data set quality, bias, and drift for regulatory submissions? Without established standards in this area, what would you recommend as foundational steps?
Yeah, this is I'll take this one just briefly. I'm sure Abbas had a lot of thoughts on that too. But I would say, yeah, we're in the transition period. Obviously, a lot of regulatory agency are trying to seek for harmonizing the practices across, different jurisdictions, because AI ML devices in general, actually, from my perspective, actually, it's more region specific than many other non-ML devices. For instance, the standard of care in EU can be drastically different from standard of care in the US. So when we did a submission in the past, the ground truthing process that's typically acceptable based on the standard of care in EU, in fact, is not acceptable by the FDA, right? So there are many, many other instances where the original specific factors that would affect how you develop ML devices. But at the end of the day, we just have to pay close attention to what the harmonized organization are doing, IMDRF or AI, a working group, exactly what they're doing. We actually talk a lot about the topics that each of the subgroup are working on. They have their set schedule to publish those standards as well. But in addition to that, obviously interfacing with the regulator directly, such as the FDA pre-submission, is a perfect way to gather those feedback directly and specific to your application, right? So I think my 2 cents here is look at what the harmonization efforts are doing overall, because that kind of gather all the different jurisdictions, regulators thinking, to be aligned and synchronized. But secondly, take advantage what the FDA has been doing in the past 3 to 5 years, and really based on the upcoming fiscal year 2025 guidance document. I think the momentum will not stop there. There will be more guidance document being published by the FDA, and this would be an area that FDA have to focus more on, because there are hundreds of devices, ML devices, that's on the market already. And you rarely see FDA being so proactive on publishing a like a guidance that has a drastic impact like a PCCP in a software space before, because this is an imminent need. So I firmly believe that the framework would be established probably sooner than many people thought. And we just have to be proactive on recognizing what the regulators cared about. Right? And this is why we wanted to emphasize on this particular topic, even though there is no specific regulation set in stone. In all fairness, right, comparing to many other device types.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew. Abbas, do you have anything to add, or do you think that was pretty?
It's pretty good. I mean, just a couple of things, as Andrew mentioned, it's a newer thing. So a lot of the frameworks are still being developed, not just within the healthcare space, but also within the non-healthcare. I mean, AI/ML systems elsewhere have the same challenges, maybe not the regulatory challenges, but same challenges in terms of identifying performance, identifying, data set quality, for example. And a lot of those, comes down to there's no harmonized way to do it. And a lot of companies are developing their own ways to do it, identifying their own KPIs to look at data quality, and kind of doing a lot of monitoring to kind of understand what those KPIs should be. It's an evolving field. So as Andrew mentioned, I think sooner rather than later, we will have some sort of standard or framework or best practices developed, specifically around what the regulators are interested in. And I think, but as of this moment, we don't have a very good answer.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, another question is, I noticed that design controls appear to start relatively late in the process in this framework. Given that design controls are typically foundational for ensuring traceability, risk management, and regulatory compliance from the outset, would you recommend starting them earlier in the development cycle for AI/ML-enabled devices? If so, what best practices could guide early stage design control integration?
I'll start and then Andrew follow up. Yes. Yeah, it says yes. Design controls should be integrated in any software development, any development, any medical device development. Let's just keep it that way. Whether that be SMD, traditional SMD, or just a non-software device, or an AI/ML device. Obviously, an AI ML takes a slightly different path to design development, but a lot of things you can still do, like version management, as Andrew mentioned, just managing your records, doing basic documentation around how your ML is going to process data, how you're going to acquire data, what is the data acquisition, what's your data labeling, cleaning practices. All those are essentially SOPs eventually. So a lot of that can be documented as you develop them, and part of your design control should be integrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Okay.
think we definitely agree that it has to come up front. Maybe there's some presentation within this webinar that we gave a wrong impression. However, this is critically important. And again, like we talk about this a lot at MLOps and DevOps. The way the asset that you're managing is drastically different, and how the FDA reviewer review a data-driven model versus a heuristic, software code base is drastically different. And even the team that they're reviewing from the FDA department are different too, right? So there are many considerations in a nutshell, and design control, obviously, it's very at the top of the priority for any ML devices, ML device development life cycles.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll take one more question and then the rest we'll address separately. We'll, like I said, send out those responses with the recording and slide deck tomorrow. Okay, another key regulatory consideration is sample size and dataset version control. What are your recommendations on calculations of dataset sample sizes, confidence intervals, and reliability? Do you recommend using the standard ISO 16269 Part 6?
I can give some feedback on that, and I'm sure
Okay.
Abbas had some as well. I think this is a very tough question to answer, because it really depends on, I guess, in a nutshell, what type of validation that you have to do, and what type of device output that you're trying to give out to the audience. For instance, are you giving out the device output based on a tier-based system like low risk, medium risk, high risk, versus like a scoring system from 0 to 100 with a 1% increment? That implication on the number of samples that you need is drastically different. Okay, so the device output design obviously would impact this sample size consideration. On top of that, from our experience, the very crude estimation is to look at what other people has done, right? So what the product device has done, and obviously there are many source information that you can try together, those sample sizes in general, but it really comes down to how you interpret the data and describe the data to the FDA and determine the adequacy of training or validating this data this against the data sets. Okay, but if in all I guess general process is general. This is agnostic to ML devices, I guess. You obviously will do some pilot study, right, to to compare your device against a pre-specified metric, right? You have to determine that priori in a way, right? And before you determine that sample size for external validation study, with a predefined power, or some error that you give as a reference, based off the similar device that you see on the market, right? Obviously, this is the kind of expertise from a CRO, or whoever it's very, deeply knowledge in the biostatistician space. But I would say the sample sizes for training, I wouldn't consider this is really, I would say this is agnostic to device type. even though some people might argue it's not. But I would say at the end of the day, if you follow through that same statistical approach, agnostic to ML devices versus non-ML devices, FDA would accept anyway. And if there is a shortcut, such as predicating off your PEG device, how many samples that they have procured, and you try to replicate that, if FDA thought this justification is sufficient, they'll be okay with that. But seems to me that that's something, it's a little blur to draw that line. And honestly, I don't know too much about this ISO standard that's this audience brought up, but certainly I should look into it and see if this is something that we can leverage down the road. Yeah. Abbas, do you have any thoughts on that front?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I'm not familiar with this particular standard as well, but it's always a hard problem to solve, and it always very, very specific depending on kind of what is it trying to do. So the output, it's very, very, the sample size depends on that. But in general, yes, I don't have much to add.
Well, thank you. We're actually out of time. So as I mentioned, we will address the remaining questions separately and get you guys those responses. But thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Andrew and Abbas, for the great presentation. It's very informative and we appreciate it. So thank you and
Thank
stay
you
tuned
all,
for the
and
resources tomorrow.
yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
And happy Veterans Day. Bye.